Good morning and welcome to Trending. 24 years after 9/11, I expected to be sat here talking about that catalyzing event and how it changed the world. But instead, I'm sat here reacting to what feels like another catalyzing event, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, a very, very, very prominent and influential political commentator in the United States. Now, all I can say at this point for certain is whatever the accepted official narrative is, whatever they land on, who did it, why they did it, how they did it, that will not be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So I'm just going to cover one story today. As I said, I expected to be talking about 9/11. It's 24 years since that fateful day, and obviously everyone watching this knows, what that's evolved into in terms of bringing in the Patriot Act, in terms of the wars in the Middle East, the implementation of the project for the new American century. We know that. So last night, just before going to bed, to see the assassination of Charlie Kirk it felt connected. It felt connected to September the 11th. This is a story from the BBC this morning. Obviously, everyone's covering it. It's all anyone's talking about, which is understandable. The headline reads, "Manhunt for Charlie Kirk killer continues as Trump says it's a dark moment for America." Charlie Kirk was doing what he often did, giving a talk in front of an awful lot of people, giving a talk and going into his prove me wrong style debate when a figure wearing dark clothing appeared on a roof and fired a single shot, hitting him in an artery in his neck. Now, a single shot that hits you in the artery is not some radical leftist guy who's been, sent doolally by watching too much MSNBC. It isn't. That's a hit. It's an assassination by a highly trained gunman who was then able to flee the scene. And as it says on the BBC, the manhunt is underway. If you can go to a rally with an awful amount of people, an awfully large amount of people like that, and carry out an act like that and get away, you are not a regular run-of-the-mill crazy guy that's been, watching too much CNN or taking too much Ritalin. It's not what it is. Another thing I found quite interesting about this is that the escape of the shooter was in no small part down to, it seems, from the information available at the moment, to distractions within the crowd. So the first thing we saw was this older gentleman, this bald gentleman, who was said to be the shooter originally, and then it turned out that he wasn't, but had apparently shouted that it was him, which of course would have distracted the police and the security. And then there was more accounts of someone apparently pretending just around that time with a little plastic pistol or a water pistol, things that were creating distractions within security and within the crowd. So I don't believe in coincidences, and they would have almost certainly assisted the shooter in getting away. The article continues. The footage on social media is gruesome. Yes, it is. It is gruesome. Eyewitnesses described seeing a fountain of blood gushing from his neck as he raised his arm. Kirk's own personal security was there, and they took him in a private car to hospital where he was declared dead. This has set off a lot of fear in the US about the future of the country and about political divisions, as these things are meant to. Now, it's a horrendous killing, and as I understand it, it was in front of his wife and children, young children, which I honestly, and this is the thing, you see, like, would I agree with a lot of what Charlie Kirk says? Probably not. Some I would, 100%. Some I would align with. A lot I wouldn't. But we should be able to have a conversation, and we should be able to have a conversation publicly about that. And so, whilst I don't believe it's some, radical lunatic, although to be fair, if you become an assassin, you have to be a bit of a radical lunatic. Let's have it right. I do find it bizarre that there are quite a large number of people, some of which, they're not internet trolls, they have large followings, basically celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk and saying, well, he defended the deaths of children in Gaza. which he did, and that would be a massive disagreement, a bone of contention I would have with his views. But if you're going to have a problem with him defending the death of people in Gaza and then basically celebrate or dismiss his death as irrelevant, then that doesn't make you any better. So your moral high ground that you felt you were stood on, that is kind of crumbling away beneath your feet. And once we're at a point where we're celebrating or meh towards the death of another human being, that doesn't bode well for the future of humanity, I'm afraid. And I understand there's division on both sides, and both would point and go, well, you didn't care when this, and they didn't care when this, and whatever. But someone needs to be a grown-up. There needs to be a grown-up in the room. That's like, yeah, okay, you justified the death of these people. I don't agree with that. So I'm not gonna let my vibration lower to that level. I'm not gonna do it. Someone's got to break the cycle of hate. They have to. They have to. There has to be a grown-up in the room eventually that walks in and says, stop it. And that comes from us. Now, in terms of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, of course, Charlie founded Turning Point USA, which is expanded into Turning Point UK as well. It's a massive organization. He's a young guy who, to be fair, would debate on lots of different topics, would be open to lots of different views on lots of different stuff. I don't always agree with them. Some I did, some I didn't. And that should be fine, to be able to agree and disagree on certain things. But when I look at this, I think, okay, well, the first question is obvious. Who benefits? That'd be the first question you asked if you were a homicide detective on any other killing. If you turn up at a house and there's a body and they've been murdered, the neighbors maybe, rung and said, I've heard a commotion and whatever. The first question you'd ask is, okay, who benefits from this person's death? Is there someone about to inherit a load of money from their death? Is there someone that's about to, inherit the control of a multinational corporation when they're gone? Did they have information on someone that would be very, very detrimental to that person that they wouldn't want out, and therefore silencing someone would be in their best interest? These are the questions that you'd ask, and therefore these should be the questions that we asked. And what is quite surreal to me is, this comes a day after I'd written an article basically saying that we were entering false flag season. Now, to clarify, as I always do, because false flag sounds like you're saying it didn't happen or it's made up. It's not what false flag means. False flag means essentially what we're told happened and what the people we're told did something isn't what happened, and it isn't who did it. It's not saying it didn't happen. So, for instance, JFK being shot by a lone gunman in Lee Harvey Oswald, I don't know anyone that still believes that. In fact, I don't think most people by 1964, just a year later, believe that. That's a false flag, right? So it's not saying JFK wasn't killed. We've all seen the footage. Just to clarify that. But I wrote this article saying that I felt false flag season was coming. And I said, I applied it to the United Kingdom, but also to the world. And the reason why is because for some time now, you can, and maybe you're the same. You can feel the scene being set. You can feel divisions being built and growing, and you can feel anger in people's bellies. A lot of it righteous on a lot of different topics and in lots of different countries. And so I've been looking at that for some time, thinking this is a powder keg moment. Like everything's set for the match. Now, what I mean by that is if I light a match, say I'm stood in the field, right, and I light a match and I chuck it on the floor, what happens? Nothing. Probably nothing. Even if it's been hella sunny, maybe a little bit starts to catch. But overwhelmingly, if you do that, nothing's going to happen. However, if I get a lot of bone-dry newspaper and bone-dry wood kindling and bone-dry logs, and then I douse them in kerosene, and then I chuck the match, then what happens? So what I've noticed over the last few months, and indeed years, to be fair, is that pile, that bonfire being built in all different aspects of our lives. And so I wrote that article because I thought to myself, we are getting towards prime time in terms of someone with nefarious motives would want to drop a match at this point. Now, it feels very much at this point that at least in the United States, what happened to Charlie Kirk yesterday could well be that match. And I think a lot of people are feeling it too, and it's something that even the mainstream media are talking about. Of course, there's lots of talk at the moment about who could have done it, why they did it, how they did it, lots of theories, which is to be expected, of course. People are slowing down the footage and looking at who's this guy, who's, and of course that's what's happening. Some may be very, very interesting and valid, and some may not. And that's just the time that we're in at the moment. But who they officially blame, I don't mean who, John on Twitter blames. I mean who the official blame is laid on. What I mean by that is who the mainstream media blames, who the government blames, who the intelligence agencies blame, who the FBI blame. Will tell us a lot about who did it. Because that will direct our ire and our anger towards that person, that group, that demographic, whoever it is that they blame. And at this point, it could be anyone. They could try and blame it on a radical leftist with trans ideology, given the fact that at the time of the shooting, Charlie was talking about the number of transgender shooters in high school shootings. So absolutely could be. He's been outspoken on Ukraine. So could they blame it on a Ukrainian? Could they blame it on a Russian for whatever reason? Could they blame it on an Iranian? Could they blame it on a Palestinian based on his pro-Israel stance? There's so many different options here that for me, whatever one they settle on is the one I'll go, okay, so that's what you want me to believe. That's where you want everyone's ire directed. Okay, well, who will gain from everyone's ire being directed at that specific group? And whoever that is that gains from that is who I'm looking at. Now, they're saying, we're all saying, anyone with eyes to see is saying that we've basically never been closer, certainly not in my 43 years on this planet, never been closer to civil war in the West. And events like this, something like this, will only amplify that. Because, Charlie was massively influential. His organization was massively influential. People even speak, my brother even spoke today when we were talking this morning about the fact that there's people out there that thought he was a potential future president. I mean, he was 31 years old, which to me as a 43-year-old, I barely remember being 31. He's a kid. So the idea that he could go on in his 50s or whatever and become a president of the United States is not beyond the realms. Depending on, of course, on how connected he really was and stuff like that, because of course presidents are selected, not elected. So I look at it and I think just because he's on one side, so he's seen as being on one side of the political sphere, he's also seen as being one side of the Middle East debate, he's seen as being on one side of the Russia-Ukraine debate, one side of the gun debate in terms of the right to bear arms. He's seen as being on one particular side of all that. So your kind of, I guess, your instant thought would be, well, it's someone on the other side then. It's not going to be one that he aligns with. Of course it's not. That doesn't make any sense. It's going to be someone on the other side of these particular divides. And then you say to yourself, well, what if someone on his own side on any of those debates stood to gain more from him being killed than they do from him not being killed and going around and giving rallies and commentating on social media? Then it's also not beyond the realms that someone on his own side of those specific fault lines might well be involved in this. And people who listen to that and go, oh, that's mad, they wouldn't do that. And then you go, well, today's September 11th, mate. Killed thousands of Americans without a second thought. which led to the death of millions in the Middle East without a second thought. So people that can carry out acts like this against one man, yes, it's heinous and it's disgusting and it's beyond the pale, but there's people out there, potentially the very same people, that will carry out acts like September 11th, like the London bombings, like the Madrid bombings. And that's the point, I think, that people need to realize, just in life in general, actually, is that you can't judge what someone else is capable of based on what you're capable of. And we're all guilty of it. We've all done that. We look through our rose-tinted glasses of, well, that's not possible, because you're basing, less so now given the world we live in, but you're generally basing reality on your experience of reality and your feelings of what is what. And I've had that many times where people have said to me, oh, they wouldn't do that. And you're like, no, you wouldn't do that. There's people out there that abuse toddlers and babies. And often when you come back with that, they go, yeah, it's disgusting. But the point I'm making is that people are capable of doing that. So the idea that someone is capable of taking out someone at a rally, these psychopaths are out there, and it's worth having an open mind to who is behind it. That's for sure. Now, one of those things, which has kind of taken a lot of people by surprise, given the fact that Charlie Kirk was massively vocal in his support for Israel, hugely so. There's lots of theories going around now basically saying he was starting to notice. He was starting to change his tact on Israel. I saw a bit of evidence of that, but, he at least on the face of it, was still massively pro-Israel and was very much in support of what was going on. But something because there's a lot of videos circulating. One of them was from a little while ago, but it's resurfaced now, obviously, for obvious reasons, where he's acknowledging that October 7th was allowed to happen, that Israel allowed that to happen. Now, I sit here, and that's obvious. They obviously allowed that to happen. All the evidence points towards that. IDF soldiers have spoken about their stand-down orders. There's even been articles in Haaretz, in the Jerusalem Post, in the Times of Israel, talking about the fact that there was clearly something going on here. Several IDF soldiers, former border guards, came out on the day of September 11th, on the day of, that was a fraudulent slip, came out on the day of October 7th saying, this couldn't have happened. I knew if, one quote was, I knew if there was a cockroach near the fence. And as Charlie was saying in this particular bit of footage, that the fact that Israel is the size of New Jersey and it takes 45 minutes in a helicopter to get from Jerusalem to the Gaza border, and yet it took the IDF 6 hours to respond to reports of the attacks of the mass murder that was happening, both at the music festival and in other areas along that border fence. So he was asking questions, which would be a problem, and I accept that, okay, and I can see why people are starting to theorize that. So I looked a little more, and then I found footage of him talking about Epstein being a Mossad agent, which again, we all know that, obviously, but to be coming from the mouth of a massive asset for Israel in American politics, particularly around young people, because Israel's lost the narrative with the youth. It has. They openly admit that. So having him as a big voice within that youth movement, someone that young people looked up to, particularly on the right, if he starts asking questions about things, that is a problem, and I will acknowledge that. That is a problem. He was talking also about freedom of speech laws, and very recently had a public disagreement with Trump's anti-Semitism laws. Basically, Charlie Kirk was saying, no, that's not how free speech works. Whilst I disagree with what people are saying, because obviously he is a very, pro-Israel, was a very pro-Israel guy, that freedom of speech is freedom of speech, and that should protect all speech. And I am aligned with Charlie Kirk 100% on that. If one person out of 8 billion in this world doesn't have free speech doesn't exist. Because all that means is you're free to speak within the pre-agreed parameters of what free speech is. That's not free speech. That it's not. It's like saying to someone, you're free to go wherever you want in the world. You can roam wherever you want, but you can't go there. Well, I can't roam wherever I want them. It's the same thing when it comes to speech. So he'd spoke out about that. He was talking about the overrepresentation, of pro-Israel donors within the US political sphere. Of course, again, we all know that to be the case. But for that to be coming out of my mouth is irrelevant. For that to be coming out of Charlie Kirk's mouth, a very influential man to again, these young future voters, is a big deal. So I saw that and I started going, okay, all right, well, there's a question to be asked, as there always is. And then I saw a tweet, and you will have almost certainly too, because it's everywhere, went viral, from August, from a guy called Harrison H. Smith. Now, he presents a show, American Journal, on InfoWars. Now, he'd made a show basically talking about how Charlie Kirk and Megyn Kelly, I think, were doing the show together, and how they looked, and they seemed nervous. They didn't seem themselves. And he presented something along those lines. He was alluding to the fact that what they were concerned about was their stance on Israel and public opinion turning against Israel, was that their fear was that they were losing support, basically, for their stance. He then went on after that to be contacted by a friend, and he tweeted and has gone on record last night confirming that tweet and confirming that situation, where he had a conversation with a mutual friend of Charlie Kirk's, who said that Charlie Kirk had said to him that he feared Israel would take him out if he turned on them. So again, it's worth having a conversation about. Netanyahu came out and was one of the first to pay his respects. Now, to look at this, I go, do I believe the Mossad and Israel could take out Charlie Kirk and then have it blamed on someone that would garner support for them? Well, I mean, they murder kids for sport and starve kids to death for sport. So yes, of course, I believe they could do that. I believe they were fundamentally involved in 9/11. I believe they were fundamentally involved in the assassination of JFK. But that doesn't mean they did. It's the day afterwards. There's loads of stuff going around. I've got questions. I've always got questions. I wake up in the morning and go to bed at night with questions. So I definitely think it's worth asking them. And I think what could also be telling is if we're not allowed to ask them. If we start attacking anyone that asks questions about certain things, I want to look at what those certain things are that they're talking about. Not necessarily even just Israel, anything. Saudi Arabia, whatever. Now, the reason I'm focusing on foreign nations is because the FBI have come out basically saying they believe it is a foreign agent. It's a foreign intelligence agent that's assassinated him. But then again, just because the FBI is saying it doesn't mean it's true either. Doesn't mean it wasn't them. Doesn't mean it wasn't anyone else. And so that's why it's really important to keep an open mind. And when you hear stuff like this, like these multiple things that link at least the idea of Israel's involvement, to go, okay, that's interesting. Okay, well, I'm going to put that there. And that's how big that pile is getting of information. Then you start hearing other things. Okay, well, that's quite interesting. I'm going to build up a pile of that. And then after a period of time, you start to see which pile is going where. And you're going, okay, well, the overwhelming evidence is either this or that or that or that or whatever. But the key part of all of this is to do that calmly, is to remain calm. Because I'm seeing so many people now getting very, very angry. It's the leftist, it's this, it's that. There's anger. You've taken out one of ours. Ugh. And what does that mean? What were you going to do? Retribution? This was a hit. This wasn't some blue-haired radical idiot. It was a hit. And why? Now, there's another thing going around which is quite interesting. Again, there's loads of stuff going around, but where a private jet left a nearby airfield. I think the airfield, from what I was reading, is about a 12-minute drive from where the shooting took place. The aeroplane takes off half an hour after the shooting, and which would make sense. If it's a 12-minute drive, you're out of there, you're in the car, you're gone, 12 minutes, bang, you're on the plane, on the runway, bosh. And then the transponder of that private jet was switched off very quickly, which is not the done thing. So there's questions to be asked about that. Was that the shooter on that? It looks that way on face value, but again, you just have to question everything. But what I know is that there's more to know. And as I said at the top, all I'm certain of is that we're not going to be given the official truth by official sources. Now, Trump is already talking about, punishing those responsible. Now, if those responsible, are the shooter themselves or the organization the shooter was genuinely attached to, then of course, that's what needs to happen. But from the way he was speaking and reading between the lines a little bit, it was more alluding to the Democrats, the Democratic organizations, the Democratic media, that they basically blame for vilifying those on the right and calling them Nazis and all that kind of stuff, that would then radicalize people into acting in a violent manner. And of course, there is a lot of that go on, and it goes on the right as well, by the way. There is a lot of that goes on within the media. But I'll go back to the previous point. This wasn't some radical, crazy dude. This was a hit. But what I fear will come from that will be the shutting down of these organizations or the silencing of these organizations. Now, bear in mind, left and right, Democrats and Republicans at the top, I'm not talking about the grassroots, I'm talking about at the top, they're the same. There's a uni party in the United States in the same way there's a uni party in the United Kingdom and every other country on the planet. And we used to accept that. And the alternative media used to know that. It's regressed into left and right politics in recent years, but there's still a lot of you watching this that accept there's a uni party at the top. Now, as you come down from there and you start going into different organizations and grassroots organizations, they're not the same. They see things differently and they think differently. They have different views on certain things, whether it be transgender issues, whether it be American foreign policy, Middle East wars, whatever, right? And what you need if politics is going to work, not that I'm a huge fan of politics, but it's what we've got at the minute. If it's going to work, you need a balance between both sides. You need whatever side is in government to be called out by the other side for their actions. And then when the other side gets in, you need to be able to call them out and you hold each other to account. So you can't go quite to the extreme. Because if you go to the extreme, all you do is you alienate the other portion of the population. And as long as you've got a situation where some people are winning and others are losing, you've always got a large group, especially in a country as big as America, a large group of disenfranchised people. That doesn't work for anyone. Even the ones that are so-called winning, if a lot of the people around them, their neighbors, are hugely suffering and are disenfranchised, that's not a good thing. What you want is, in an ideal world, what's sort of best for everyone, where everyone, gives up a little bit but wins a little bit. And most people, I believe, can live with that. And so by silencing the other side, whether it be news outlets or whatever, you take away the balance. And any country in history, whether it be Nazi Germany or whether it be, Stalinist Russia or whatever, or Maoist China, it's never good when you take out the other side. Never good. I mean, even now, look at Zelensky in Ukraine. I mean, we're supposed to be focusing on Putin bad, whereas Zelensky is essentially a dictator at this point. That's not a good thing. So that worries me. Now, what also worries me is we've got a major gathering in London on Saturday. And I was talking about this at the start of the week on Tuesday's Trending, where it concerns me because here in the UK, that tower of kindling and kerosene that I was talking about earlier is there as well. And it's waiting for a match. I feel like traps are being laid. And if anything like what happened to Charlie Kirk yesterday was to happen on Saturday to an individual or, to a group where there's a battle and there's injuries and deaths or whatever, then this place will go up. This place will explode. And you look at France, it's carnage there at the minute. Even Nepal, is carnage at the moment. You can see this whole thing is happening all over the world. And then I start to think, and I thought this morning, I'm like, I'm looking at World War III and the idea behind that. And you go back to Albert Pike's prediction of World War III of essentially political Zionism versus Islam. And then I'm looking, okay, so what is Israel and Iran, is that going to kick off? It kicked off a bit. And obviously Israel's bombing of Doha just a couple of days ago. Could that lead to something? I mean, no one's really talking about that now, obviously, but could that lead to something? And now I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at what's going on in the streets of Europe and indeed across the globe. And I started thinking to myself, maybe, just maybe, this third world war that we're being primed for isn't between separate nations. Maybe it's within the nations. Maybe it's a war that's taking place on 3 continents that therefore, fits the definition of a world war. But it's not nations fighting against each other. It's the people of those nations fighting against each other. Another aspect to this is gun laws. A lot of quite ghoulish people when Charlie Kirk was killed, because he's very much pro-gun laws, pro the right to bear arms, were straight in there with now he's lost the debate. And that's an interesting take, because a lot of the people generally, I am generalizing, but a lot of the people that are pro the right to bear arms would be those on the right. And then one of your heroes, one of your great hopes for the future is murdered with a gun. So should it come out that it was a hit, but say they try and lie to us, because that's what governments and media organizations do, tell us that it was some crazy guy and he got his gun from a local gun store or off the internet or whatever. Will then people on the right, I listened to a couple of spaces last night where people from the right started bringing up gun laws, and maybe we need to have a conversation about it. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's interesting. Is that part of it? Now, I'm not a pro-gun guy. I'm not a pro-weapon guy. But I am of the belief that if the state has guns, then the people should be allowed to have guns too. I don't think anyone should have guns, if I'm honest. I'm not a fan of guns. But, whatever. Like, if I travel to Eastern Europe and my mates want to go shooting, I tend to go do something else. It's not something I'm interested in. I know a lot of you are, and that's sound. But I do believe, as I say, if the state's allowed them, then the people should be allowed them, because they should be allowed to defend themselves against the state. Because the state is the enemy of all of us. Let's have it right. That's why it seeks to divide us all the time amongst ourselves. So could that be part of it? Yes, because then once you take the guns off people, you can attempt to introduce draconian measures by force, because people can't defend themselves. Now, if you've created a situation where essentially the world's on fire, metaphorically and literally, then that's a pretty big problem. And that's a pretty big problem that's going to garner a pretty big reaction. And that pretty big reaction is going to allow you to come in with a solution. And what would that solution be? Well, it will lead with, we need to make sure this can never happen again. How can we do that? Well, we need to bring people together. So we need a one world government. Could bring everyone together. We need a one world army, because that would stop any wars. Because why would there be a war if there's one world army? What's it going to do? Fight itself? That's how that will be sold. But of course, the answer is no. What that one world army will do will go down and crush anyone that dissents the one world government, refuses to go along with it. But that's not how they sell it, because it wouldn't be much of a selling point. A one world currency, which is digital, because then that's ultimate control, and you throw in the digital ID for that as well. So you know where everyone is. You know what everyone's buying. So no one, bear in mind it's a hit, no one, but if they tell us it's some radical guy, he wouldn't have been able to purchase that firearm. Or even maybe they, because there's a manhunt going on, maybe they don't catch them. Maybe they never catch who did it. But if we had digital ID, we would have a digital paper trail of who bought that weapon, where they got it. And we would know who it was, but we don't know who it is. So this young father's been murdered in front of his family, and there's nothing we can do to catch the perpetrator because we don't have the systems in place to be able to find out what everyone's doing at every point. We need that. And that sounds stupid, but people will go along with that. People will go, yeah. Because it will be sold as a way to keep us safe. Let Charlie's death not be in vain. We need to do things differently. And so I go back to what I said at the start in terms of reserving judgment on who's responsible for this. And I'm reserving that judgment. Yes, there's certain things that people are saying that I'm finding interesting. But I reserve judgment until I see who's blamed for it, who's officially blamed for it. Who I'm officially being told to hate. Because that will tell me that, one, they're not the one responsible, but whoever gains from me hating that particular group, whoever they may be, because we don't know right now, needs to have some serious questions asked of them. Now, another aspect of this, which is something that's dawning on me, given I normally sit here and I do 4 news stories, but there is only one news story right now, is what else is going on September the 11th, 2025, that we're not seeing. Because everything is focused on this, which I understand. It's horrendous and it's a big deal, and it's like, as I said, potentially chucking a match on a bonfire doused in kerosene. It is. So what else is going on today? What else? What is happening on page 25 of the newspaper? I think that's something maybe to spend a bit of time today looking at. Because as, you know, the Tony Blair aide famously said on 9/11, this is a good day to bury bad news. It's 9/11. But final thought on this, fear of sounding like Jerry Springer, is this is a point where we all need to keep our heads. Everyone, please. Because if we kick off and we blame our political opponents, bearing in mind for the 100th time, this was a hit. This was not some crazy guy with a gun he bought off, I don't know, Amazon. It's not. So rather than hating our political opponents or our ideological opponents or what we consider to be opponents, let's just take a breath. I understand being angry. I get it. Take a deep breath and go, what they want is to divide us. They want to divide us to rule us. That's obvious. It's story as old as time. So whilst I'm annoyed and angry and I'm, you know, as a lot of people are, I'm not going to allow that to happen. I'm going to breathe deeply. I'm going to look into it as much as I can. Not by asking grok, but by looking into what's going on and looking at what's being said on both sides, what evidence I can see and what's happening, and just remain calm. And I would say just one final point, obviously being in the UK, for people that are going to this major rally and protest in London, please be careful. And you know, for me, I'm one of those people that trusts my gut. I always have done throughout COVID, the protests and all that movement. You know, I was offered places to stay. I was offered lifts to certain protests. I was offered all of this stuff. You know, come park here. These are where we can park. I always drove myself. I always drove straight home. And I always parked the opposite side of the town or city that I'd been told to park at. Now, that's not to distrust the people that were organizing protests. They were great people. But you don't know how much stuff is infiltrated. And I wanted to be responsible for myself. So I took myself out of those situations. And there were a few situations where I felt something wasn't right. And every time I was right. And I took myself out of situations where I could feel my gut. I don't feel right. I don't feel right. And I would leave early or whatever. which is funny because then that fueled the conspiracy theories that you were in on it. But I would say to people, if you go to London or you wake up on the morning of the event and you don't feel right and you've got that inherent knowing within you that something's not right, listen to it. Please listen to it. Don't go with an attitude of, well, I've already bought my train ticket. Well, I don't want to let people down. And even if you're there and you've gone there and you start to feel uncomfortable, you start to feel it, just take yourself out of it a little bit. You know, maybe just stand at the side and listen to the speakers. I'm not telling people not to go and protest. You should be free to do what you want. I'm just saying, if you feel something in your gut, please listen to it, because it's rarely wrong. But thank you so much for listening to my opinions and my views and stuff this morning. Take care of yourselves. And my brother will be back tomorrow, no doubt, with a lot more information related to what's happened and what is indeed happening across the world, because we're in crazy times, folks, and we need each other. Whether we're aligned or not, we need each other. See you later.